Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody to our third annual National Grand Rounds. Thank you all for coming out. We have three great presentations from senior leaders in our field. We have 2 hours of interaction time, so so we'll be able to get some good questions answered and some good networking as well. The second hour was really intended to have some NIH program officers come in and join us. However, due to some changing commitments at the last moment, we won't have any. However, we're going to have our esteemed speakers interacting with us a little bit longer. So what we'll likely do is after each 20-minute presentation, each one of our presenters is going to give a 20-minute presentation. We'll open it up for questions and then also allow them to bounce off of each other and to add their thoughts to anything that you guys have to ask, and then we'll probably also break up and then let you all ask more intimate questions afterwards. So I'm going to start out just by introducing each one of our speakers. So immediately to my left is Dr. Barsan, who's a professor and former chair of the Department of Emergency Medicine at University of Michigan Medical School. His academic focus has been on the translational research in stroke and neurologic emergencies. Very accomplished PI for the Clinical Coordinating Center for the Neurologic Emergencies Treatment Trials Network. Co-PI for Adaptive. The principal investigator for the clinical coordinator for the Clinical Coordinating Center for SAEM. PI on Hobbit, and the contact PI for brain optimization and severe traumatic brain injury Boost 3 trial, which is now underway.
Great. All right, thank you very much. I always worry when people talk about senior leaders. I think he's trying to say that I'm old, but he's right. Anyway, I have only disclosures I have. Do I have them up there? Only disclosure I have are basically the funding from the NIH and nothing else at this point. So we were told we could sort of talk about whatever we wanted to talk about, and so one of my one of my new favorite things in about the last 6 or 8 years in research is adaptive clinical trials. So I have chosen to talk about that. For those of you who heard this talk before or heard it from Roger Lewis, because Roger and I use a lot of the same slides, you can close your eyes. I got involved in this with a thing called the Adapted Project, and Roger Lewis called me from UCLA, and he said, there's this RFA out for a regulatory science proposal, and we have to apply for it. I had no idea what he was talking about, but it was basically one of the best things that we ever did. This was a grant funded by the NIH and the FDA, and it was to look at regulatory science different aspects. And what we proposed to do is to design some Bayesian adaptive trials for them, designing with them, and then they would see, they were trying to get an idea of whether or not they could actually approve new drugs or devices based on these kind of trials, because were fairly new at that time. So this was a public-private collaboration. So the PIs on it were myself and Roger Lewis from UCLA, and also Don Barry, who at the time was at MD Anderson Hospital. He's a PhD statistician. We worked with the Neurologic Emergency Treatment Trials Network, which I ran at that time, and with Barry Consultants, which Don Barry ran, which is a private statistical consulting company. So it was an interesting collaboration. Probably the best part of it is that we got to work for 3 years on these trials with people from NIH and FDA. And, you know, FDA has always sort of been like a black box, you know. One never knows what goes on behind the doors of FDA. But this was being able to design 5 trials with FDA personnel was just enlightening, to say the least. I mean, it was kind of one of the coolest experiences I've ever had. And it was very enjoyable, and we learned a ton. So let me talk a little bit about adaptive trials and what we wanted to do with this project. Main thing we wanted to do, number one, was to illustrate and explore how best to use these trial designs to improve the evaluation of drugs and medical devices. And the second thing was to use mixed methods to characterize and understand the beliefs, opinions, and concerns of key stakeholders during and after the development process. And that part was really cool. I'm not going to talk about that mixed methods analysis because I don't have the time, but We had focus groups of study section members from NIH study sections, FDA people, NIH people. It was just really sort of a unique opportunity that you usually don't get the chance to do something like that. So for those of you who aren't familiar with adaptive trials, we'll talk a little bit about what they are and why you would want to use them. So whenever you design a trial, and I've been doing clinical trials since the mid-1980s, you always have uncertainty when you design a trial. There's uncertainty about how best to treat subjects in the experimental arm. You might be uncertain about the dose, the duration, the target population. And, you know, usually what you do is you make assumptions, and the assumptions often are wrong. And when your assumptions are wrong, your study is basically invalid. So to me, as somebody who does clinical trials, there's nothing worse than to do a clinical trial, and let's say the trial fails. And the failure isn't that the stuff doesn't work. The failure is you didn't design the right trial. And that's something I never want to do again if I can help it. So, but when you have uncertainty and you have to make assumptions, and you have to have all these trial parameters predefined before you start the study, you really have an increased risk of negative or failed trials, even if the treatment might work. One of the things that's very cool about adaptive trials, if you think about it, if you're doing a 1,000 patient study and let's say you're at patient 500, even though everything's fixed, you can't look at anything for the rest of the study, you're already accumulating data on a lot of patients that could potentially be used to modify some trial parameters to help you avoid getting the wrong answer in these studies. And so adaptive designs are really designed to take advantage of that. So they actually take advantage of that accumulating information on patients that are going forward to help inform the way the trial evolves for the rest of the trial. The philosophy basically is that you need to look at things differently than you do with a regular frequentist trial. So with a frequentist trial, a lot of times your goal or your primary outcome is like a positive, p-value, a significant p-value in something. In an adaptive design, a lot of times the goals or the primary outcomes can be very different. So I'll give you an example of one that we're doing right now, which is a hyperbaric oxygen brain injury trial. And the primary outcome of that trial is that if you went forward to do a phase 3 trial, you would have a greater than 50% probability of a successful trial. You almost never see studies with a primary outcome like that, and it's a very different approach to clinical trials than the usual thing. With adaptive trials, you take frequent looks at the data and you do data-driven modification of the trial. This is adaptive by design, though. You don't look at data and then think about it and then change the trial. You do all this ahead of time. So at the beginning, it's a long process. It takes 3 to 6 months to design one of these things. But you try to think of all the ways your trial might go wrong, and then you try to make adaptations in there. And I'll give one. Let's say you had a reservation about whether patients over 65 were going to benefit from your treatment. So in most trials, you're forced to either you enroll them or you don't. What you can do in an adaptive design, you can start by enrolling them. You stratify randomization of those patients. And if at a certain point in time it looks like the patients over 65 respond differently than your patients under 65, you can drop that patient population and go on with an enriched population, but you know the answer. So you can do things like that that are very helpful. You also use computer simulation to really fine-tune the study and to really design all the key trial characteristics. And I'll show you some examples of a simulation a little bit later. So the definition is that you make making planned, that's the key thing, well-defined changes in key clinical trial design parameters during trial execution based on accumulating data as you go along. So it's got to be planned. You have to define them all priority. You have to define the criteria very well. And these have to be really key criteria like dose, duration of treatment, and things like that, not minor sort of inclusion criteria. And basically what you do is like this, and I think this show up good. Yeah, so you start here. You've got data collection. You have your initial allocation, your sampling rules. You start enrolling patients. You analyze the available data. You look and see, did I need a stopping rule? If you did, you stop. And if you didn't, then you go into this phase where you look at whether you need to revise allocation or sampling rules, continue data collection, you go to the next interim analysis, and then basically you repeat that again and again and again. And it's a circular process until you either hit a stopping point or you reach the maximum number of patients in the trial. And then the trial is over. So why would you want to do this? I want to do this because I don't want to get the wrong answer. As I mentioned earlier, I really don't want to do trials anymore that are non-informative. And it's a very interesting thing. You know, and sometimes people are really reluctant to get into this because they think they really know all the right answers to begin with. But usually if you take people out of their comfort zone, it's clear that a lot of times they really don't know all these parameters that they think they know. The other reason you want to do it is you want to do it to avoid taking too long to get the right answer. So if any of you remember the spinal cord injury studies with methylprednisolone, there was a NASCUS 1, a NASCUS 2, a NASCUS 3, and you know, my goal is to never have to go beyond acronym number 1, right? Because when you're doing NASCUS 2 and NASCUS 3, it's because you didn't do NASCUS 1 right. And when you do NASCUS 3, it's because you didn't do NASCUS 2 right. And so if you get the study right the first time, hopefully you just have to do one trial, which would be a lot better for the patients who are enrolling in these trials and also for science. And then another thing that's really important is you want to avoid anticipated regret. So a substantial fraction of all confirmatory trials fail despite promising learn phase trials. So how many times have there been phase 2 trials that look great and you know the things look wonderful, it's going to cure everybody, and you go to a phase 3 trial and they fail. And by the way, the normal success rate on most phase 3 trials is about 25 to 30%. So the vast majority of them fail. And a lot of times you wish, when you get the failed trial, that you could take it over. You know, you could go back and say, oh. And so what we do when we're designing these things is we have this great anticipated regret question that we ask people, and we design the trial, get it all set up, and then we go to the investigator and say, okay, if this trial fails, what do you wish you would have done differently? And that is always a really key point. And we, you know, but sometimes people are really reluctant. We were designing a trial with one guy who was sure he knew the right dose on a neuroprotective agent. And I pushed him. I said, you sure you know the dose? I absolutely know the dose. It's only this dose. Lower, higher won't work. I said, okay. So we finished the thing. We got the anticipated regret question. And I said, okay, well, what if this trial fails? Are you willing to walk away from your drug and never do anything again? He said, well, no, I'd use a higher dose. So it's amazing how people can just sort of put on blinders sometimes. So why not adapt? I'll be very short because I don't have a lot of time. It's hard. It's not easy to do. It takes 3 to 6 months to design an adaptive trial. You need statisticians who know how to do it, and trust me, there aren't that many statisticians who know how to do it. And there are various logistical issues. You have to have data availability. You have to have centralized randomization. You have to be able to change the drug supply at the sites and stuff because you might change who's getting allocated to which arm. So it's not easy. It's very doable, but it's not easy. And the other thing is, that those of you who design clinical trials know who pays you to design clinical trials? Nobody. You know, a few of the institutes have planning grants. NINDS, for example, doesn't anymore. They don't have those. NHLBI does. But a lot of times they don't pay you to design these things. So that's all freebie. And if it's going to take 3 to 6 months to design, it's very tough to talk people into doing it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Bayesian adaptive strategies. How am I doing on time? Good. And these are some of the things I'm going to talk about. I'll go into these in a little bit of detail, and then I'm going to show you one quick simulation at the end. So one of the hallmarks of doing Bayesian adaptive trials are frequent interim analyses, and these happen a lot. You're used to most studies might have 1 interim analysis, maybe 2. These trials have 5, 6, 7, 8 sometimes interim analyses, so there's a whole bunch of them. And they're estimates of Bayesian posterior probability distributions. You do multiple imputation estimation of unknown clinical trial parameters, and you're trying to quantify these things down there at the bottom. And so a lot of times you're gathering data that's not complete. So let's say you're doing a study where the primary outcome is at 3 months. And at the time you're doing an interim analysis, some patients have already hit 3 months, but some patients just finished a week ago, and some finished a month ago, and some finished 2 months ago. You impute data from those patients who are not finished yet. Sometimes it's not very hard. If you're doing a study where patients might die and a patient is dead at 1 month, they're going to be dead at 3 months, and you know that's going to be the same. If they're alive and perfectly normal neurologically at 1 month, good chance they'll be neurologically normal at 3 months. But there are some of the things that you build a longitudinal model as you go along to try to predict how these patients will do as the trial goes on. The longitudinal modeling is the next thing, and so you have this model that evolves over the study, that all these patients that you're looking at 2 weeks and 4 weeks and 8 weeks, you're building a model to predict what they're going to look like at 3 months. So you're improving the study as time goes on when you're using those data points to impute changes in the trial design. One of the things, and this is a really powerful tool that we use a lot, is response adaptive randomization. And a lot of people have talked about this as pick the winner. It's sort of a pick the winner. It can be different things. But you basically can start changing the allocation of patients between the groups. You can actually drop arms and add arms. There's a lot of different things you can do. But basically, you can address one or more of these things. You want to improve subject outcomes by preferentially randomizing patients to the better performing arm. It's always nice at the end of a study that, you never want to be the second to last patient entered in a study, because you already know the answer, right? The answer is already known. And you might get randomized to the group that doesn't work, right? The nice thing about adaptive designs is that the chances are very, very good that if there's one treatment that's effective, many more patients will have had that treatment than will have had the ineffective treatments. And that is ethically a real win to me as far as I'm concerned, and I like that aspect of it. We sometimes use this to improve the efficiency of estimation by preferentially assigning patients to doses in a manner that increases our efficiency. So it's not always picking the winner, but sometimes it's like, I don't know enough about this certain dose, and I need to put a few more patients in this dose so I learn more about it. You're going to also improve the efficiency by addressing multiple hypotheses and randomizing patients in a way that emphasizes sequential goals. And I mentioned earlier that can include arm dropping or arm adding. The decision rules that we make are based on predictive probabilities at each interim analysis. And so some of the decision rules are: you might define success or futility based on the predictive probability of success if the trial is stopped and all patients are then completed. You might define success or futility based on predictive probability of success in a subsequent phase 3 trial, and that's what I mentioned in the Hobart trial. So that's our really primary outcome, is to say, if we did a 1,000-patient trial, we want to know that it would be positive at least 50% of the time. You may combine probabilities logically. Probability that an active agent is both superior to control arm and non-inferior to an active comparator, et cetera. And you can also make these seamless, so you can seamlessly go between a phase 2 and a phase 3. I know I'm going kind of fast here, and I apologize. Dose response modeling, I think, is really important, and we'll talk about this with the model study that I'm looking at, that I'll show you some data on, which is IceCap. And so what you're really trying to do, rather than saying I'm going to test 3 doses and I'm going to get a p-value on A versus B versus C, you basically are creating a dose response model. So you're going to create a curve that shows how patients respond to different doses, and you're better able to pick out the right dose, and I'll show you how that happens. And then you can use enrichment designs, and I gave an example of this earlier, like with the example of the patients over age 65. So you can look at subgroups that you think may not respond the same. You can include them initially, but if they look different as the trial goes on, you can eliminate that group of patients, and then your trial population is enriched. So you're squeezing it down to the patients who are most likely to benefit. Sometimes we know at the beginning of a trial which patients are most likely to benefit, but often we don't. And so when we only have hunches, we can actually prove whether those hunches are correct or not, and let the data tell us whether those hunches are correct or not. And so these are some really powerful tools. And then one of the most powerful tools is you do extensive simulations of trial performance. So for some of these trials, we do thousands of simulations to look at how things might work. And you need some powerful statistical tools. You need it depends on the study. Some of them are fairly easy to simulate, but for some studies you need really, really powerful programs that can impute lots and lots of data and a lot of different things. But basically we'll run between 5,000 and 10,000 clinical trials, simulated clinical trials, to see how they perform. And what that's really doing is that's your type 1 and type 2 error right there, right? So you don't plug it in. Most of the time you're used to, well, I've got this study design, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this, and you go to a statistician and say, tell me what my p-value is going to be in my type 1 error. How you determine that in an adaptive design is you have data. So you do 20,000 simulations, and you see out of those 20,000 simulations, and you know when you're doing the simulation because you're saying the right answer is X, okay? And then you run the trial 20,000 times, and you say how many times does my design not show that X is the right answer, and how many times might it show that, you know, that I get a false negative or a false positive. So you're really doing it in a way that's really very, it's very reproducible because you've done it by reproducing thousands of different trials. So I'm going to talk real briefly. Right now, when we started this project back in 2010, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think NIH had ever funded any Bayesian or complex adaptive trials. Most of them were being done in industry at the time. They have now funded more. We've got 3 of them funded right now through NET and Siren. One of them is the hyperbaric oxygen brain injury trial, which I mentioned. The other is the ESET trial, which was a status epilepticus study that just finished, and the results are being prepared for publication right now. And the third one is IceCap, which is a study that got a good score at study section. We hope we'll get approval to start this. And I'm going to show just some simulations from this, and then I'll be done. So IceCap is looking at what is the best duration of hypothermia to give to patients who've had cardiac arrest. There have been some studies that have shown that the initial studies looked at 12 hours, 24 hours. There's been a study done on targeted temperature management in Europe looking at different durations of therapy and at different levels of hypothermia. And basically, they haven't had enough studies, enough patients to know for sure what the best thing is. And so what we're really looking to do is to actually put nail this down and say, this is the right dose of hypothermia for somebody who's had an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. So this is, if you were doing this study, this is how most people would usually do it, right? So let's say you're looking at 12 hours of cooling, 24 hours of cooling, or 48 hours of cooling, which is sort of the 3 things people have looked at. And this is the number of patients here. So if you're going to do a 900 patient trial, it'd be 300, 300, 300, right? And so you're going to do this, and let's say that you do this study, and this is what you get, all right? So what does that tell you? Well, it might tell you any one of these things, and it's not really clear what it is. It might say there's actually no difference between any of the 3 doses. It might show you that there actually could be a chance of harm if you use a higher dose. But depending on how you draw your lines through these confidence intervals, you could come up with different answers. So you could see in a study like this, it would be very easy to do the study and go, you know what, I'm still not really sure. I'm not really sure what the right duration is. So we designed this study to look at potentially cover all of these different durations. Primary endpoint is a 90-day modified Rankin score, and we are going to be essentially running 2 parallel studies. One with patients with shockable rhythm and one with patients with non-shockable rhythm. There's going to be 900 patients in each arm, and they essentially run independently from each other, but they have the same design. So there's an initial burn-in period where you enroll 150 patients in each arm. 50, 50, 50, 50 at 12, 50 at 24, 50 at 48, and then you start doing interims, and then you start doing response adaptive randomizations. And so you start then changing the number of patients randomized to the different treatment groups based on their response. And every 50 patients, you're looking at it again, and you're running the data, and you're adjusting your allocation of patients. And this is sort of what this is what it looks like in the simulation. So this is like look 1, right? So here we go. We've got sample size down here. We've got 50, 50, 50 of patients here. And this is the initial data from what we've got, and these are the confidence intervals around it. So you can see the confidence intervals are very high, but our computer program sort of runs what we think this might look like based on this first look. And what you do is you keep going along and you keep entering more patients, and these confidence intervals you can see start to shrink. You can see we're opening up a lot more arms because we're trying to get more data at more arms. It looks like maybe the sweet spot is around here, but we're trying to get a lot of information from a lot of different arms, and you keep going. We're up at look 21 right now. You can see the confidence intervals are getting a lot narrower. You can see that a lot of patients are being put in this area. There's still patients out here. We've even got somebody out at 72 hours. And then this is look 23, which I think is the final look, and this is what it looks like. So there's two things you learn from this. One, looks like the sweet spot is around here, because if you get a curve that looks like this, it looks like it's getting more and more efficacious, and then you've got the curve flattening up here. So somewhere around here is the best dose, and that's based on this dose response modeling. It's going to be where the curve starts to flatten out. The other thing you can see is that most of the patients that are entered in this trial are entered in the sweet spot. Okay, so they're right around the duration that looks to be the most effective, which is really a valuable thing. This is what the data looks like in the end with this one. Obviously, this study was the truth that we had was that 24 hours was going to be the best duration, and in fact, this simulation showed that it was. And that's sort of where we're at with this. This study, like I said, I hope will be done soon. The conclusion from ICECAP is that a flexible design is more likely to find an optimal duration. If it isn't, either 12, 24, or 48 hours. More patients get allocated near the best duration, and it provides additional evidence regarding where the plateau is. And it also gives you information about whether cooling works. Because one of the things we ran into when we did this, we were talking to the FDA, and they said, you know, we're not really convinced hypothermia works. So you really have to have a control group. And we talked to them and said, you know, I don't think people are going to accept having a control group with no hypothermia at the time. But we proposed to them, what if we can show this? Whoops. What if we can show this, and we can show that basically outcome gets better if you increase the dose of hypothermia. So you've got evidence that in fact there is a treatment effect, that it's not all the same, and that one dose, a higher dose of hypothermia appears to be better than a lower dose. Would you accept that as proof that in fact hypothermia works? And they said, yeah, we would accept that as proof. So this sort of accomplished two things by using this design too. So that is and my last slide is that not all trials should or need or should have adaptive designs. I think some trials like this one, like ICECAP, it's really beneficial when you've got a complex question to answer. When used appropriately, they can improve efficiency and reduce cost, maximize information obtained, and minimize risk to subjects and sponsor. One of the nice things about these adaptive designs is you can fail early. And if I'm going to fail, I'd rather fail early. I'd rather put less patients at risk, fail early, and know the answer, than keep going on and on and on when you could have known the answer 200 patients earlier. The design decision should be based on objective performance rather than habit. And an adaptive design won't save a poorly planned trial or an ineffective treatment, but it'll enable you to hopefully arrive at the answer faster and you either succeed or fail more efficiently. So thank you. That's all I had. I guess we're going to do questions later? Yeah. All right.
Let's open it up for some questions.
All right. Great. Happy to answer any questions people may have. I know I blasted through a lot of information very quickly, but yes, in the back. Right.
And they sort of end up sinking it. So have you seen that? That somebody says, awesome, I love your adaptive design, and someone else says, it's too complex, and what advice would you have to deal with that?
So the question was, if you have this, making these really complex designs, does it increase your probability of having a study section pick it apart? That's a very important question. And in fact, at the end of the adaptive process, one of the things that we were supposed to present to NINDS, or to NIH in general, was what are some recommendations that we would make, our group would make, in terms of avoiding things like that. What recommendations can we make so that people will actually understand this better? And one of them was that we suggested that, you know, when there are adaptive designs, they should try, when possible, to put somebody who's knowledgeable about adaptive design into a study section, maybe as an ad hoc reviewer. There's sort of been, you know, a lot more press about this, so people are a little bit more familiar with it. And I can tell you that in the last few years, the success for some of these has gone up pretty dramatically. I mean, the fact that we've got so we've submitted 4 adaptive designs to study section. 3 out of the 4 have been funded so far. So that's a pretty good personal track record. I think that there are others besides my experience in that have worked pretty well. There have been some stroke trials that Roger Lewis has been involved in and others that have worked pretty well. So I think people are starting to realize this is valid and this is something people can do. And even one of our focus groups of statisticians were conventional statisticians and statisticians who do adaptive designs. And it was very interesting because the conventional ones were, we had actually one meeting with a statistician from a well-known emergency clinical trials group who I won't mention. And when we were talking with FDA about this and describing IceCap, his comment was, well, I'm not going to drink this Kool-Aid. Seriously, it was pretty impressive. But I think that was several years ago, and I think that impression has changed a lot. The key thing is that if you're going to do one of these, it takes a lot of brain power and it takes a lot of work, and you have to get people who really know how to do these. Because if it's not done well, any study that's not done well is not done well, and having an adaptive design doesn't save you from that, right? So you really need to do it right. But that's a great question. Other questions?
I have one.
Yeah.
So I'm sure some people in the audience are kind of like me, that you're still trying to get patients to sign in the right place on the consent form. And so what about your training background made you feel ready to start doing studies like this? Or what was it that drew you to this type of design in your training?
So it wasn't really my training, it was my experience. My experience was I didn't want to do dumb trials that didn't succeed and that you didn't learn anything at the end of it, right? And it's just, especially being in an area of stroke and neuroprotection, traumatic brain injury, there have been a host of neuroprotective agents that have been tested and all have failed. And I'll tell you, here's this very sad part. The thing that really disturbs me is that I really feel that we probably need to go back and do all those studies over again, because usually they used one dose, they used one selection criteria, and there were very likely could have been wrong assumptions made in those trials that made them negative trials. Not that the agent didn't work, but you just designed the study wrong. Unfortunately, a lot of times when the study, when it fails in its primary outcome, it's done. Nobody wants to look at it again. But there's a host of, discarded neuroprotective agents that may very well work. The other thing, and I won't, get on this too much, but another thing you can do with adaptive designs is you can start doing combining agents, okay? And when do you ever see that? And, it just makes sense to me that would work in neuroprotection, right? Because you've got all these different pathways for the brain to get destroyed, and if you block one, but you don't block the other 30, right? I think the brain's still going to die, but it doesn't mean that one isn't helping. It's that you don't have the other things going along with it. And although it's not entirely analogous, sort of compared a little bit to like HIV treatment, right? If you did HIV treatments, we're going to look at one HIV treatment. Oh, none of them work very well, right? And they're not really very effective. But you combine them and they work really, really well. And that's something we haven't done. The adaptive design process enables you to do that in a very meaningful way, and you can actually look at combinations of drugs, and even more than two. You can look at 2 or 3 sometimes, and maybe even up to 4, to get an idea of whether they work. So I think that's the main impetus for wanting to do it. I think the other thing is you have to realize as a clinical trialist that I hate to admit it to anybody, but I've never had a biostatistics course in my life, and I am not an expert biostatistician. I know, but the key thing, and that's what team science is all about, right? I know what I know, and like working with Roger and working with the Berries, they know what they know, and they know it really, really well. And so I don't need to know that. I just have to understand the concepts, and I have to, know that they understand really the guts of how this stuff works, because I don't. But, you provide the clinical impetus and stuff and the clinical knowledge that would say, well, what are the important things we need to look at? And designing these trials is really team science, because you need to get a lot of people together and say, really, really very objectively and in a teardown mode say, how is this trial, how can this trial fail? And how many ways, you can't always prevent a trial from failing by looking at every single thing, but you can really cover a lot more of them than we usually do.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
next speaker is Dr. Gausche-Hill, who is the Medical Director for LA County EMS, Professor of Clinical Medicine and Pediatrics at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA and Clinical Faculty at Harbor UCLA Medical Center. She is internationally known for her work as an EMS researcher and educator and for leadership in the field of EMS as a pediatric emergency medicine physician, and has won numerous national awards for her leadership in emergency medicine, pediatric emergency medicine, as well as EMS.
Thank you very much. Gosh, note to self, never follow Bill Barsan speaking, or maybe be before Tammie, because I know they have great things to say. But this is a really good dovetail, because I was going to come out, and one of the first things I was going to stress, and a la the title of my talk, has to do with collaboration. Doing research is a team sport, is what I was going to say. This is not something that anybody can do alone. It has to be done together, and as a team, you can be far more effective. I'm going to focus my talk today on what I've done in the past and what I hope to do in the future. And it kind of really highlights some of the things that Bill already mentioned relative to doing a large randomized trial and at the end going, now what? So I'm going to talk about collaboration, some of the challenges, and some innovative approaches to trials. And this will dovetail well with Bill's talk. Anyway, nothing to disclose. One of the first things I want to say is working in silos are a thing of the past. This is not something where one investigator runs a trial, then publishes it. It's always on a team. And anything that I have done that has been successful has been team play, working with various stakeholders who have different levels of expertise that can join a team. I love this quote by Henry Ford: coming together is a beginning, staying together is progress, and working together is success. And that is what will give successful research endeavors, is working together, staying as a team, bringing in other team members with expertise. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Pediatric Airway Management Project. The vision of the project was to really understand what was the best method to perform airway management in the out-of-hospital setting. It was a very simple question with a lot of complexity in terms of how to answer it. The other thing we wanted to do is we wanted to say, all right, now that we know the answer, what are some of the other factors around implementation of this in EMS systems, such as what does it cost, how long do they retain the skill, is there a cost benefit for one therapy over the other. The other thing that I think can be very helpful, and you've seen all these trials with acronyms, you know, like COACT and PRIME and DAWN and all of these other things. The reason is it gives it a name, and therefore everybody is operating under a common vision. And I really believe that this is true. It's just basically branding. And although I didn't have a really cool acronym for the Pediatric Airway Management Project, I did have a really cool logo, okay? And so this, as well as the work that we've done on the National Pediatric Readiness Project, basically said, we are a group, we are together on a common vision, and this is our vision. And so this was my vision many years ago. I'm going to talk about that and how I might leverage that experience to answer, hopefully, the ultimate questions in airway management for children in the out-of-hospital setting. As many of you know, we did publish a very large randomized trial in the out-of-hospital setting. This was pre all the FDA regulations on exception from informed consent, but because Roger Lewis was my co-collaborator on this trial, we were able to actually effectively do EFIC prior to EFIC. So it was a large randomized trial. The goal was to evaluate survival and neurologic outcome by randomizing bag mask ventilation and endotracheal intubation. Here's all the people that were collaborating. I had nurses, nurse trainers who helped train all the medics. I had EMS medical directors as well as myself. We had various departments, EMS provider agencies, and we had about 3,000 paramedics who participated at that time. In addition, the state of California, at that time, you know, when I started approaching funding agencies, they go, well, we don't fund that kind of research. And I thought, wow, this is going to be really tough to get money. But the state of California had federal block grants, and we were able to get funding through that. The Maternal and Child Health Bureau came out with Targeted Issues Grant, and at the time I wrote an 80-page grant on a randomized trial of airway management, and I could not use the word research. So it was a project, it was a program, but it was not research. So those were some of the barriers that I had to deal with. In the end, we were getting close to the end of our funding, but we hadn't enrolled the anticipated 800 patients yet. And so I was approached by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and they said, we're going to take you home. And that was really a tipping point for us to finish that trial, because they funded the last part of the trial. And then also the American College of Emergency Physicians just had a section grant that I also applied for. And by the way, with the state of California, for all 3 years of the project, I had to reapply every year, so that was a bit distressing, but we were able to get it done. But ACEP funded the section grant, so we created a video to explain why it was ethical to do a randomized trial of children in the out-of-hospital setting, which we distributed to all 425 or so stations in LA and Orange County. So again, here's our objective. We wanted to look at survival and neurologic outcome of pediatric patients treated with BVM versus ET in the out-of-hospital setting. It was some time ago. It's hard to believe it's over 20 years ago, and we still have many of the agencies in the United States doing endotracheal intubation, even though there's no positive effect on outcome. But so we looked at, the study was approved, the IRB at Harbor-UCLA Medical Center under waiver of consent, and I had to seek approval from 114 other receiving facilities, so we went through 115 IRBs. This is why some of the conclusions are going to be you really need a central IRB or a consortium IRB in order to do these large trials, because it's extremely difficult to accomplish this. It took me almost 2 3/4 years to get approval from all of the centers to get the outcome data. We were in two large EMS systems, LA and Orange County. LA is probably one of the largest EMS systems in the world. About 1 in 25 paramedics in the United States practices in Los Angeles County. We had a total of 800, we anticipated a need of a total of 800 patients, approximately 400 in both arms, and we used 12 years or younger, estimated body weight less than 40 kilos. This was based somewhat on the use of the Broslow tape. And then, believe it or not, we only lost 10 of our patients to follow-up. So that is a real testament to my co-collaborators and nurses. We trained 3,000 paramedics approximately in a 6-hour pediatric airway management course, so this was truly not a pragmatic trial just based on what you already know. We said, we don't think you know what you need to know in order to do this, and so we looked at training. We were criticized quite a bit because they said, you know, I don't think your training was adequate, but when I looked all over the country to find out how people were training, it was all over the map, and we had the longest training course, and we divided it in 2 sections based on, you know, educational theory that you had to reinforce this over a period of time. So we did 614 courses over 2 years, and then the paramedics could enter once their agency had completed the course. So when we look at this, there were 830 patients, 420, and we did a pseudo-randomization at this time. This was the easiest. This was based on feedback by the fire departments who felt if we did any kind of block randomization, We talked about geographic randomization, but since there were more drownings in Orange County than in LA County, we had concerns about that. The block randomization they felt was going to be too stressful, and so they needed to know that day what they were going to do when they, stepped into their station. They wanted to know, and so based on that, we did a pseudo randomization of even, odd, E for ET, and odd was BVM. And as you can see, we had 416 patients in the endotracheal intubation arm and 404 in the BVM arm. We had very few protocol violations. Sometimes they worked to a second shift and they couldn't remember if it was an even or an odd day. But since we talked to them all after they entered the patient, we were able to understand where the protocol violations took place. We analyzed this by intention to treat. When you look at this, the overall results, survival, BVM was 30% and ET was 26%. You see the odds ratio. This was not statistically significant. And when you look at the 5-level neurologic outcome, we used PCPC, that the BVM was 23% and ET was 20%. We did several interim analyses. We almost stopped the trial multiple times, but in the end, we did not have to stop the trial. I think for me, there's many lessons that I learned here. One is, as an investigator, you have to be flexible and take some of the information that your stakeholders are telling you and somehow incorporate it into the trial. The other thing is that you have to anticipate problems all along the way. As an example, it turns out that all the bag masks, the masks that we supplied, were deflated. And although many paramedics came up with, creative solutions such as, using Gorilla Glue and blowing them up with TB syringes, in 24 hours we had to replace all the BVM masks in all 400 plus rescues in LA County. So that created, I put a call out, help, we need help, and then people rallied, and all of a sudden I had all these fire departments saying, okay, we'll have these, multiple pickup points around LA County. So these are some of the logistical things. I am not the statistics person in this collaboration. I am the cheerleader, and I'm also the logistics person that says, you know what, we can do this. I don't care if everything has gone wrong. I think we're going to get this trial completed. And having that level of enthusiasm and commitment does make a difference in getting something done. So what are the next steps and what have I learned? Well, we got to the end. We showed that there was no difference. Many people didn't believe us, but and that was okay, because that's just the way it is. Facts are friendly. You have to just understand that that's what happens. But we were ready to gear up again to do another trial, but it was just so challenging, the amount of effort that it took. And I just want to highlight what Bill was saying is that if you can develop and pre-plan such that you don't have to utilize so many resources, the likelihood you'll complete another trial is way higher, okay? Because otherwise it's too exhausting to do it. So as you can see, there was considerable effort that was put into implementing that trial, which was truly implemented over 2 3/4 years, although it was 7 years in the making, okay, from beginning to end. So what are the next steps? I think to collaborate with a large number of EMS systems to, again, answer new questions in airway management for children. One of my co-collaborators, Dr. Barsan, is here from the LA County EMS agency, and she has reached out to the Eagles, which are a kind of loose group, but a group of medical directors for EMS systems, the largest urban EMS systems in the United States, and really 34 of them are willing to participate in a trial such as this. We believe that the combined numbers of potential pediatric patients for enrollment is over 5,000, which is huge when you're talking about doing a trial of this kind in which airway management is very rare. Just to give you a rough idea how rare it is, I had estimated in California it would take 20 years to get each medic to do either BVM or ET on a pediatric patient once. So it is a real challenge. We surveyed the EMS medical directors. 100% of them have BVM in their system or bag mask ventilation. 68% still have pediatric endotracheal intubation. Many are moving to iGels and King, even without any evidence that they improve outcome in the care of children. But this is how things go because it's so hard to evaluate this. And 9% with the LMA. The BVM is still the gold standard. However, you can see that many other advanced airways or supraglottic devices are used. So really it was a time to rethink design. I had talked with Dr. Lewis about this. Dr. Henry Wang is also, he will probably lead the charge ultimately in a new part trial or PD part. The concept would be to use these adaptive techniques, which Dr. Barsan's already outlined for you, that will allow agencies to participate who would not otherwise be able to contribute. We would incorporate these adaptive design concepts to utilize what is known really from a previous arm of the study, and I'll show you some examples of that. Really, the other thing is because there are many different devices now, we're not just looking at BVM versus ET, we're looking at BVM versus iGel or BVM versus King, BVM versus LMA, ET versus a supraglottic device. The complexity of a trial like this, but as we are going to learn from each of the arms, we will be able to begin to address which is the most effective airway management for pediatric patients in cardiac arrest, just trauma, hopefully, as well as in respiratory failure. The pragmatic component of it is what does an EM system do and they do well? So as an example, BVM and iGel, they do those well. So that's what they're going to randomize on, you know, because we know that they do that already. And then it's going to be very complex. It's probably going to take us 6 months to a year to actually do all the simulations. But the whole idea would be to begin to figure out, based on what is superior versus non-inferior, and as we move through the design, how to really know how many MS agencies will be doing which airway management technique. So this is just a rough idea, a conceptual design that Roger really had come up with me when we talked about doing this initially. So you randomize, say, BVM versus LMA. If LMA is superior, then LMA goes to the next step, and you'd randomize LMA with iGel. If iGel is superior, then you would randomize iGel to King, as an example. It is highly likely that BVM is going to be shown to be non-inferior, in which case BVM would continue to move through. So as you can see, if indeed BVM remains non-inferior, basically, that what you would find is that BVM would continue to move through, and we'd have a systematic number of comparisons between bag mask and the various supraglottic devices, as an example. So this is an example without integration of endotracheal intubation. Here's a lot of the potential comparisons that could occur in a trial such as this, but each time you're learning from each arm about how effective bag mask ventilation is, as an example, in taking care of patients in cardiac arrest, trauma, and in respiratory failure. And again, we also learn the performance of these other devices during each arm of the trial. So when we thought about this and we began to design this, you can see the complexity is beginning to increase. And the reason the complexity is, we're now not just comparing two devices, but we're comparing multiple devices and learning from each step in order to bring in another device. This is the beauty. This is so you don't get to the end and you go, but what if we did iGel instead of King? What if we did, right? You can see that you would get to the end of the trial and you'd still have to do a whole huge trial again. So the concept here is to learn from each step, bring in other devices, and really get a great idea of what's going on. If we're going to compare everything that we want to compare, this is what it begins to look like. So you have a trial cohort where an agency might have endotracheal intubation and bag mask ventilation, so then you now want to add a supraglottic device and evaluate those. So you'd start with ET BVM. If BVM is not inferior, then you move to the next device, which would be, say, King LT. So the complexity is huge, but by pre-planning and rethinking design and not just doing your typical randomized trial, but doing a trial where at the end of it you feel like you've done what you need to do to answer the question versus at the end of the trial having more questions than you had when you started the trial. So IRBs, we were having a discussion just a few minutes before this talk, is just about the complexity of IRBs and dealing with the IRBs and the idiosyncrasies of IRBs. One of my visions for at least implementing pre-hospital research is developing a consortium IRB. That is that you have one overseeing IRB for which all of your hospitals within a system or region sign on and all your EMS agencies sign on. They all agree to utilize that IRB, and there would be reliance agreements with the various institutional review boards from the hospitals within the system. The FWA could be through either the academic centers or which are going to have them, or really the private IRB consortium would hold the federal-wide assurance to be able to ensure the use of federal funds to do large trials. And I think that's probably the only way to do it. To go to 115 IRBs, it's just, I did it when I was younger. I'm a lot older now. I'm not going to be able to do it. And many people, you just don't have the stamina to deal with that many IRBs. So I do believe, and I know, you know, having a central IRB for federal studies is really good, but not everything is going to be federally funded. So developing these kind of consortium agreements to answer these questions to simplify the process. So really, I'm going to end with this. Designing the next trial in airway management for children requires a large research consortium. There should be alignment of purpose and utilize innovative designs in order to make this happen. That design incorporates both pragmatic and adaptive concepts, because pragmatic concepts allow for some of the logistics to take place. Adaptive allows for you to answer questions more efficiently. And I think I'm sold on it, and I'm hopeful we'll be able to implement that trial, and I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you. Yes.
Great, thank you. Question for, I guess, you, Dr. Gausche-Hill, and maybe you as well, Dr. Barsan. Thinking a little bit about these complex trial designs and the gaps that exist in the translation of evidence and research evidence into practice and policy, and then anticipated barriers that might arise around translation of the results that have come up, particularly in sort of these more complex designs. How are you thinking about, translation, knowledge transfer, implementation as you're designing the studies? Because you can imagine that they pose different logistical and complex implementation challenges.
Well, hopefully I'll start and you can, hopefully we're going to anticipate some of the challenges, but I'll be honest with you, you never anticipate all the challenges, okay? But you just have to be flexible enough and committed enough to push it through. translational is a very interesting concept. It's a challenge to get any study, the results of a study, translated into clinical practice very quickly. One thing is by having it well designed and peer reviewed and all of that, it is extremely useful in terms of credibility. The other thing in implementing a trial like this, if we have 30 different EMS agencies, at least, those 30 presumably are going to be vested in the results of the trial. But the other thing is to include other stakeholders that could help with the translational part of it. As an example, some of the professional organizations, it could be the National Association of EMTs as an example. If they sit on the steering committee, will help promulgate the results and support the results, then that can be really useful in terms of providers or international firefighters or NAMSP for the physician arm, ASEP EMS. You might bring in some of these people early on, and one reason we had success is all the people that were vehemently, not all, but a number of the people that were vehemently opposed to doing a randomized trial, I brought on my steering committee. And I said, I need you to tell me what you think the way we should do this in order to make it work. And I'll be honest with you, one of those people suggested, okay, if you're so committed, you need to carry a beeper and talk to a medic after every one of these kids is enrolled. And we did that, and that saved the trial. And that was based on somebody who didn't want to participate. So I think that is really, really helpful for translation. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I don't have a whole lot to add. I mean, I think the way Marianne designed that trial was perfect because it was the results were not hard to implement, right? I mean, I think she took into account all the processes, the workflows, and all that stuff, and it all fit. And you weren't asking people to do something they usually didn't do, for the most part. I mean, it was maybe they choose a different thing, but not the way they do it. And fitting things into the workflow, I think, is really critical. And she anticipated bringing on the naysayers to begin with, because you're never going to implement it if there's a lot of people that say, well, I don't believe in this process and all that stuff. So I think she had the right formula, and if everybody followed that, it would be a lot easier to implement these things when they're done. There is a question, though, about some of these complex designs, though, that and we worry about this a lot with some of these, is that some of this stuff is going to look like voodoo to people, and they're going to be like, what? You put this stuff in a hopper and put on secret sauce and you come up with an answer, and it's hard, and you sort of have to think about that, and sometimes there's no way to disguise it like an ice cap that it's tricky, and people may not totally understand it, but it's a big challenge with these.
Other questions?
I have one. So no. This is just as a demonstration. So for people, because I think sometimes they look at these things and think, wow, I'll design this trial and get this done and do it. How long? I'd be interested if you even remember. How long did it take from the time you started working on this until actually the publication came out? What period of time was this?
That's what I was saying. It was probably, I said 7 years, but that's after we'd already designed the trial. So I would say probably 9 years or so, 9 or 10 years. And initially had the idea, and everybody said, it was crazy. And then Roger said, I think I want to do something even crazier. Let's do a randomized trial. And he said, you stand up and tell everybody we're going to do it. But it does take a long time, and if you believe you have a good design and you have a good study, you just you carry it through. Now it did take. Was interesting is it took almost 2 years to get it published. What ended up happening is they made us analyze it over and over again. Okay, let's do it by treatment received. Let's do it by this way. Let's do it by that way. We said, we think the best way to analyze this is by intention to treat, because, obviously, if we did it by treatment received, ET kills straight out, right? Because the patient is more likely to be successfully intubated if they're completely limp and lifeless. So anyway, that took a long time because it was very controversial, the results. And anyway, but we analyzed it all three ways, and then finally, the powers that be at JAMA said, we're going to go with the intention to treat, but we still want you to put a paragraph in about all those other ways you analyzed it, which, was pretty amazing. Anyway, all right, thank you.
Thank you. Our final speaker is Dr. Tammie Quest, who is the Montgomery Chair in Palliative Medicine and Professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine at Emory. She is the immediate past president of the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine and director of the Emory Palliative Care Center at Emory's Woodruff Health Sciences Center. She is the recipient of multiple NIH grants and foundation funding to support innovations in palliative care in the areas of quality improvement, emergency medicine, HIV, palliative care, spiritual-based decision-making and end-of-life care, and assisting in the assisted living setting. Thank you.
So thank you, Paul. So we're going to switch from adaptive trials a little bit. We're going to switch gears. We're going to take a breath. We're going to exhale or inhale or something like that. And I'm going to really tell a story. They've told some wonderful stories of developing research designs, and I'm going to tell you about developing a field and what that's been like, and to give you a little bit of a sense of where we are in palliative care and emergency medicine. And it's so funny to date myself because I don't want to be senior. I was a medical student and rotated at LA County, USC, and I just thought, she hung the moon. I was like, oh my God, she's famous. And that was like a really long time ago, and so she's been famous all of her life as far as I'm concerned. So anyway, I now, to sit on a panel with these folks is kind of funny, so I don't know how that happened, and I am not senior. So, I don't have any financial disclosures, but I am the director of the EPIC Emergency Medicine Project, as well as faculty with the Center to Advance Palliative Care, improving palliative care in the emergency department projects. And so I will be mentioning those, and I am intimately involved in those projects. So in looking at this title, Mavericks, I made that up because when I think of when we started this field, and we started this field in the 90s, really, and I'm going to give you some of that. Mostly, we have been, people who've worked in this field have been seen as a little bit of an outsider. You're a little bit strange. I remember looking for a job in 1998, and I really couldn't be hired. I went around and I told people that I wanted to do this, and they were like, that's not going to really work out. But you can work some shifts if you'd like to. And so it was only when, by happenstance, they say that, fortune, luck, it's the prepared mind, right, is luck. And my eventual husband, fiance at the time, had a wedding in Atlanta. And I went to Emory, never having been there before, and I met Arthur Kellerman. I was looking for a job. I couldn't find a job in California because this is what I wanted to do. And he said, when are you coming? And I said, tomorrow. And he said, why don't you come by the office? And I told him about this idea of palliative care and emergency medicine, or end-of-life care, where we did that. And he said, that is the coolest thing that I've ever heard. If you come to Emory, I will support you. And so we moved. And that was really, that was it. And so I couldn't find anybody who would have that kind of enthusiasm. And so note to self, lesson in life, go where people are enthusiastic about what you want to do. Often unconventional. Now it sounds a little bit trendy to do palliative care, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the value equation. I, at Emory, run all of palliative care for the healthcare system. It's a $4 million budget a year. I have 70 FTEs with 22 attendings. So I'm running a little mini department. That was not how it all started, and thinking about how that works. So before we get too far down the list of talking about things, I would like to define palliative care. And you will, if nothing else, after you leave this, have a little more information in life to be able to talk with your family. So palliative care is the care provided to patients and families suffering from a serious and or life-limiting illness, appropriate at any stage and at any age, and can be provided together with curative therapies. By definition, the unit of care is always the patient and family, so we never just want to talk to the patient. We always want to talk to them and their people, and we focus on the physical, spiritual, psychological, and social aspects of care, and so we're always thinking about that no matter what setting the patient is in, whether it's a hospital-based setting, a home-based setting, an emergency department setting. And that is to be distinguished from hospice care. Think of hospice care as an insurance benefit. In other places in the world, there is no such thing as hospice. We created hospice with the Medicare hospice benefit, that idea. In the UK and other places where we say the word hospice, it actually doesn't mean the same thing as it means here. And I remember being a visiting professor in Canada, and they take you out the night before, and they said, look, all of you Americans do the same thing. You come here and you talk about hospice. We don't know what that is. It's all palliative care here. So think about this idea of hospice, this prognosis of 6 months or less if the disease runs its usual course, is something that we had to create by CMS so that we could determine when you were able to turn on an insurance benefit. And as Jim Hallenbach at Stanford recently said on a listserv, he was there when they made it up, and it was like Goldilocks. No, this is too hot. No, this is too cold. No, this is just right. That's how they pick 6 months. So there's nothing magical about that, and I will tell you that we may see that change as healthcare changes. That said, less than 50% of people in America actually get that insurance benefit called hospice care, and when they do get it, they get it for less than 20 days. So the way I explain hospice and palliative care to patients is that everything is palliative care, and there's this little thing over here called hospice that's an insurance benefit, but palliative care is the big umbrella. When we're thinking about that in the emergency department, well, what does that actually mean? And we created this list as we were developing the EPIC Emergency Medicine Project. We went to the National Cancer Institute in 2005, and myself and Linda Emanuel at Northwestern said, we believe there is a gap in care for seriously ill patients. We believe that cancer patients, one population, NCI, always go with who the population the funder likes, and cancer patients come to emergency departments and they have serious illness and they have suffering. And we would like to train emergency clinicians to treat that suffering and to take care of patients. And they said, that sounds pretty good. And they gave us $2 million to do that. And so we actually created the EPIC Emergency Medicine Project in 2005. And one of the things that I had to do in that, through focus groups and other leaders in emergency medicine, was to sit down and say, what do we do? And so we created a list of categories and topics that actually has stood the test of time. If you look at this, this is still essentially, we created this 14 years ago, and this is still what we're writing about. And it's because when we sat down and we came up with the list, I didn't come up with it out of my head. I sat down with other important people in emergency medicine and said, what do you do and how do you take care of people and what happens? And this is what they said. We take care, they have pain, we have to have critical communications, we have to have goals of care discussions, we have to break bad news, which is very different than telling somebody that they're dead. That is breaking bad news on steroids, and the skill set is different. Saying that you have an abnormal test is very different than telling someone that their loved one is dead, and it should be treated differently. Family presence during resuscitation is very old. We think that that's a new idea. It is not new. It is actually very old in the literature. Ethical legal aspects of care, really that was the foundation, and my roots in SAEM was working through ethics, and so there's no secret of that. And interestingly, there's a parent EPIC project for which the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation funded, which is Core EPIC. And in Core Epic, there is no section on legal aspects of care. And I insisted that emergency clinicians, based on everything that I was hearing, were so much more fearful of medical legal ramifications that we actually had to have a specific session module on that. And they were dumbfounded. I mean, in the palliative care world, medical legal aspects of care are actually not that prominent. People don't worry about getting sued, interestingly, as much, but we are very preoccupied with that idea. Care in the last hours of living, caregiver support, bereavement. In caregiver support, I published a study a number of years ago that showed that caregivers whose spouses died, they were much more likely to die themselves. We have seen this, but that's in the literature. Caring for patients that receive hospice care is something that is much of a challenge, as well as referring patients to hospice care, and then withdrawing and withholding life-sustaining therapies. And so we built an entire curriculum based on this, and we have offered that curriculum every single year since 2007 continuously, and will again this year. As you see, so that was about 2005, but Charles von Gutten, who's one of the leaders, senior leaders in the core field of palliative care, really described this model in JAMA in 2002, which is that the triangle is such that the base of the triangle is primary palliative care. So every clinician, no matter what their specialty is, should have basic skills and competencies, and whether you're a radiation oncologist, you're an emergency physician, you're a pediatrician, you're a family medicine clinician, you should be able to have palliative care skills and treat patients who have serious life-threatening illness. Above that would be secondary or specialist clinicians that provide consultation palliative, subspecialty palliative care. And when I started as a young attending in 1998, there was really there were no clinicians in emergency medicine that were on quote-unquote palliative care teams. That was a non-idea, that idea at that time. And then the concept of the palliative care faculty, academic palliative care researchers and thoughts, there was certainly in the larger palliative care community in the nation, both secondary and tertiary palliative care. And so when I started out, I had no idea that I would work in any other place other than in primary palliative care, because that was where my calling was. It sort of blew up on me, and it got a little more complicated over time. So as you see, this is the model of palliative care, diagnosis of serious illness to the left. On the top graph, you'll see this is what's happening in America's hospitals and clinics and home settings, that we're focusing on life-prolonging care until as disease progresses. And then one day we walk in and we tell patients and families that we have this absolutely fabulously amazing thing called hospice, of which they are supposed to be absolutely thrilled about. And we think you qualify for this, and there's nothing else that we can do. That is a terrible model of care. No one in their right mind would think that that makes sense, yet we do it every single day and somehow expect that patients and families are going to feel like that's okay, and that there's something wrong with them, that they somehow couldn't have figured that out themselves. And so, because when we're done, then they should be done, it doesn't quite work that way. So there's a much better idea on the bottom, which is that you're going to support them from a physical, spiritual, psychological, and social perspective from the diagnosis here, while you, of course, are going to focus on all the things that we can do for disease reversal. And as illness progresses, and you are not the one that gets the transplant, or you're not cured from whatever that is, as that time goes on, we will continue to support you, and at some point you may qualify for an insurance benefit called hospice. And importantly, when death occurs in a palliative care model, we do not stop at that point, and we offer bereavement care, because the survivors after someone has died are at great risk for illness themselves. You will see that people have neglected their health, all sorts of things, and I'm sure all of us have seen those types of things, and they end up in the emergency department a month after their husband dies with a new diagnosis of something, because they actually have ignored it for quite a long time period. So in palliative care models, ideally we don't do that. And you should know that if a patient gets 1 moment of hospice care, 1 minute of hospice care, the Medicare hospice benefit or their insurance benefit provides bereavement care for 12 months to that family. And so if you always wonder why I should refer somebody to hospice who's dying now or might die in the next day, because the patient's going to be fine on the medicine service, it's for their family. Although not that we're doing that great of a job with those folks. And so you see here that as people present to emergency departments across this continuum, your skill set is going to have to be very different in ED visit number 3 than 2 than 1. And so as we think about training our clinicians, we want to make sure that we're giving them a full skill set. So our continued reality in healthcare is that the majority of healthcare dollars are spent in the last 90 days of life. However, the other more alarming statistic is that the majority of people who have serious illness are not going to go down in flames where you can recognize it in the last 90 days. They're actually going to stay seriously chronically ill in healthcare utilization for probably 3 to 5 years before they actually die from their illness. And so during that high utilization time, there will be palliative care needs and there will be needs. We are going to be interacting with these patients. I haven't even said once about the silver tsunami that's happening, because actually we're seeing seriously ill patients across the continuum at all ages, but that just happens to be the case that the baby boomers are aging. So palliative care as an approach has been shown in other settings other than the emergency department to increase quality, decrease cost, and lead to more appropriate healthcare utilization. And so there's been many extrapolations and many studies, MINI studies, in our emergency department setting that have begun to show similar. This is everybody's problem. When I started out in this, and even some of you probably hear this now, we can just intubate them and let them figure it out in the ICU. We can just admit them to the medicine service and they'll figure it out in the morning. I will tell you that the downward pressure of that is not going to last. CMS, as well as Medicare managed care programs through CMS, which it looks like they have just regular insurance, but it's actually a Medicare managed care program, and many insurers are no longer going to let that happen. And so what they're going to do is they're going to penalize the hospital for those patients that you decided that you did not want to deal with in the emergency department that you just admitted. They will penalize, and that downward pressure is going to continue to get harder and harder on every single provider. The hospitalist is going to push back and say, is there something else we can do for this patient? And it's going to get closer and closer to the front line. And it won't be because the hospital did it. It will be because the value equation is, it must be optimized in healthcare to keep this thing afloat. So quality plus service divided by cost multiplied by appropriateness is the value equation. And so that appropriateness is really right place, time, and context. I get it that maybe this should have occurred before they got to you, but it didn't. So now they're in this place and you have an opportunity to either intervene or just pass this along and let it just keep flowing. And I can tell you that that downward pressure in the next 5 years is not going to be optional. You will have to be dealing with things in the emergency department. You're going to be putting them in OBS units while they're dying and they're waiting for hospice referrals. It is just not going to continue where you can keep passing this along. So as we think about what models, there are really probably only 2 of 3 choices. There are 3 bullets. But us as emergency clinicians can provide the primary palliative care in the emergency department. We can provide the primary palliative care and initiate subspecialty palliative care, but not doing either is really no longer an option. The reality of hospital-based palliative care services that are available to you are that they are not often 24 hours a day services. They are not 7-day-a-week services. We are trying very, very hard to make that happen in many cases, but you're talking about just scale and scope. And so this would be eventually we have to be thinking about palliative care as the idea of reading an EKG. We would never call a cardiologist to read an EKG. I mean, okay, I probably have done that. I have done that before, okay? But think about how many thousands of EKGs you read before you call the cardiologist and say, I'm really not sure about this right here, and it's probably because you can't remember what somebody taught us on the right bundle branch block and the Brugado criteria, right? It's something like that. So we have some critical unanswered questions as we start going in that direction. Can primary palliative care interventions delivered by emergency physicians or clinicians, so all of our providers in the ED, improve care outcomes longitudinally? So it's really going to be, sometimes what we've done now is we're like, we will just deal with the ones that are dying, and the ones that are just real sick, we're going to pass that off and let somebody deal with that. What you're going to see more and more is that this longitudinal, the 1, 2, 3, we're going to be asked and should be, and you'll see the trials that are coming up, we're going to be trialing goals of care conversations on ED visit 2. 2 was like, you're pretty sick, and trying to help do that and basically taking that ownership. But will that effect last? Is it better than, this hospitalization? Does it have a 3-month effect? Does it have a 6-month effect? And I'll talk to you about Karita Grudson's study. Can early triggered subspecialty palliative care in the ED improve outcomes? So if you call a palliative care consult alone, so you'll see there's lots of people in our field working on triggers. So would you be surprised if this patient died in the next 6 months, 3 months, 12 months, this hospitalization, and then ordering a palliative care consult? We have preliminary data that shows that action alone actually can improve outcomes. But as I'll present in a moment, we have a lot of single site data, and we don't have any large multi-center data, particularly in different populations. What's the right timing of the intervention? I showed you there was a 1, 2, and 3 visit, just arbitrarily. Could we be doing things on, what should we be doing on visit 1 versus visit 2 versus visit 3? What's the combination? Is 1 and 2 the right combination? Is it 1, 2, and 3? Is it 1 only? I mean, I think I see an adaptive trial here. Okay, thank you. All right. And then what's the right dose of the intervention? Do you hand out an advance directive on visit 1 and visit 2? You ratchet that up and you say, okay, now we're going to have to do a goals of care conversation. What is it? We actually don't really know what those things are. So where are our barriers in moving ahead? As we think through the academic and clinical workforce, we are here the academic workforce. The academic workforce's responsibility is to educate and provide patient care. And I would say that we are still working into the culture of EM training that you must absolutely cannot pass go, cannot graduate, cannot leave an emergency medicine residency until you have done X. That you know how to use an equianalgesic dosing table, that you know how to perform a death disclosure that has been observed by somebody, not just in simulation, but actually you went and told a family that you have cared for an imminently dying patient and know how to manage a death rattle, that you've done a ventilator withdrawal in the emergency department and shown that the person doesn't look like a little guppy fish after you have extubated them. So these are the kinds of things that we have not yet baked as an academic faculty into the brains of all of our clinicians, and somehow I don't know how you think they're going to learn that before they finish residency, but they aren't going to learn it without us. So we know that more academic emergency medicine programs each year are teaching palliative care skills, but it is not standardized. And if we spent, so the analogy that I would say is if we spent so medical students graduate medical school believing that lupus is an incredibly common problem that kills everyone, right? So I would say that if we spent the same amount of time with, as we did on acetaminophen overdose or ultrasound or whatever those things are, and the way that we've baked those things in, we would be able to achieve this. But right now, our culture is really one that is saying this is not actually the most important thing. We can kind of tack this on somewhere. There are a solid number of board certified and fellowship trained emergency physicians around the country to be faculty, and I'm going to show you some of that in a moment. So what you see here, this is 2008, 10, 12, 14, and 2016. The 2018 number has not been released by the American Board of Emergency Medicine in their annual report. It'll come out at 2019 for what the number is, but that's the number of ABM diplomats who are board certified in hospice and palliative medicine. You'll see early on there was a grandfathering in period where we got to about 90 folks, myself included. There were not fellowships, and in the early days it's not even that there weren't fellowships, but they were not friendly to emergency clinicians. They actually didn't think that we were smart enough compared to internists and others to actually do a palliative medicine fellowship. And Paul DeSandre is sitting right over there, and he's one of the few. Paul, when did you finish your fellowship? 2008. So he would have been one of the very few people there, and I think like you were one of the, he was the only one in the nation who had done that. And Russ Portnoy, who was the director of his program, is an amazing individual who believed that Paul had the talent to potentially be a palliative medicine physician. So this has been a long haul, just like other specialties. And so when I and a few other mavericks decided that we did not want to see what was happening in critical care happen to emergency medicine back then, we petitioned the American Board of Emergency Medicine in a white paper. Petition is probably not the word they would like me to have said, but we wrote a white paper arguing that if emergency medicine did not join ABMS and allow emergency medicine to be one of the specialties, that we would be shut out of the future of healthcare, and hence we were right, that we have been able to, and we convinced them that there would be emergency clinicians who would do this with no real evidence, but they believed us, and the ABM signed on with the ABMS that emergency clinicians could do this. And that was it was about 4 of us who wrote that paper. I remember I hit send to the ABM, and we all just sat on our hands and, white knuckle, just waiting to see what would happen, and we were elated because we felt we had a future. And so here you see in 2016 we've had 52 people since the grandfathering time period finished palliative medicine fellowship, and I would say that we are some of the most coveted recruits for some fellowships because they have, lo and behold, found that we're pretty smart, just saying. So, not that I'm bitter or anything, but anyway. So increasingly, you'll see here also the literature. So look at the science, and this is if you combine the search terms of palliative or end of life or hospice and emergency, and look at the time period from 1998 to 2004, there were less than 10 papers published during that time. You'll see in the next 4 years, we got another 15 or so. And then you'll see the time period between 2009 and 2013, we had a skyrocket. It is seeming to mirror this trajectory here. And you'll see from 2014 to 2018, we had nearly 110 articles. And this year in 2019, there are 19 articles this year that have already been published. And so that exceeds what we did in the first four years, I would say, or 6 years of this field that we've exceeded this year. And so to say that we have steam in our engines, I think, is an understatement. The other piece is to know that there's 184 people cumulatively boarded in critical care medicine and emergency medicine in the internal medicine track. So we have actually about the same number of diplomats as does critical care internal medicine out of emergency medicine in that track. So what you'll see in the themes in these articles, and I spend a lot of time enjoying watching these articles come across, most of them are single-site clinical demonstrations, clinical triggers, assessment tools, and pilot interventions. And so we have struggle to have large multi-site clinical trials. So what I would say is that the sustaining fuel in the background, and I told you that we were off to the races and that we'd done a lot of amazing things. Really, I would say that in the EPIC Emergency Medicine Project, we have trained over 400 emergency physicians in this country in a train-the-trainer model, and I believe that that's a base Many of the people that actually ended up doing fellowship at some point sent somebody to Epic Emergency Medicine. We first got that. I remember that Kate Halpern, who had followed Arthur Kellerman, actually wrote every chair in the country and asked them to send 2 people to this course. And so we actually started in academic emergency medicine programs, and I believe that that fueled a lot of interest for people who eventually published in the field or publishing in the field and who have done things. It's a 2-day core skills workshop, 14 modules, train the trainers. We give you slides, videos for dissemination. We offer it yearly, and it's interesting because now the people that, even though we have academic people come, now I have directors, emergency medicine private practice directors come to that course and say, my group has been told that unless they can utilize ICU admissions more effectively, our group's not going to last. So they come, take the course, and go back and train their group. So, hey, whatever floats your boat. But interestingly, as I talk about the downward pressures in healthcare, we get protected from that in academic medicine some, but community emergency departments are feeling that downward pressure of the healthcare equation and are very much working in that zone. The IPAL Emergency Medicine Project was funded around 2008 through the Center to Advance Palliative Care, and we really focused in that project and continue to focus on toolkit integration for ED palliative care initiatives, so people just start something. It's basically quality improvement. What can you do by next Tuesday? 4 things you can do in a week. And it's been 2 sides of this, which is that this is mostly us educating the palliative care community about how to approach the emergency department. But what we've seen is that goes both ways, is that the toolkits, the assessments, all of those things, when it was a free product, it was really easy. The Center to Advance Palliative Care about 3 years ago became a membership organization, and it's all behind a paywall now. But it could be that your organization are actually members of the Center to Advance Palliative Care, and you would have access to all the materials. But it's been disseminated to thousands of EM and palliative care providers. MTalk 2013, Intensive Core Skills, Communication Skills Workshop on Goals of Care and Serious Illness Conversations. That's now 6 years in. Anybody in the room who does MTalk? There we go, Eric. And so I'm going to bring that home in one of the projects in just a moment. 2013 was a big year for us with launch of MTalk as well as the ACEP Choosing Wisely. The ACEP Choosing Wisely really brought palliative care to the forefront. It was pushed out to all 25,000 emergency physicians that this was a good idea. I would say that ACEP really is much more in tune to some of the downward pressures to in our field around the value equation. And that choosing wisely is part of really a downward pressure of the value equation of appropriateness and right care and high quality care. And then most recently, I would hats off to the HPM milestone project in emergency medicine, where they have laid out for you the ability to say, here are the things that you can train emergency medicine residents in, as we know that the model curriculum is slowly updated, but the HPM milestone projects is really fabulous. So our future, that is Karita Grudson there to the left, and her mentor has just walked into the room, Lynn Richardson here, and I want to bring everybody's attention as I talk through the evidence and what's some of the most important evidence in our field that is to come. It's really about, with primary palliative care education, can we make a difference? And in the outcomes, what proportion of eligible patients whose disposition is to an acute care setting versus another setting, and then a series of healthcare utilization metrics 6 months after an ED visit. And so this focuses on, we had some of the prime ER folks come to Epic Emergency Medicine last year, and we had a great time, and I know that, Eric, you're probably doing lots of M-talking with them in serious illness conversations. But really the most important thing, and this is 35 emergency departments, this will be the largest clinical trial that we have in emergency medicine to be able to show what the impact of primary palliative care in the emergency department is, and I think we are waiting on bated breath for these results. I want to bring, some of you may or may not know of the Concern Research Network that Jeff Caterino has been faithfully holding up without funding. About 3 or 4 years ago, myself, Jeff, Karita, and some other leaders were brought together with NIH and other funders to hear about what might we do in a research network, what could we do to advance the science. And so out of that, the Comprehensive Oncologic Emergency Research Network was formed, also called Concern. It's in its infancy, but they had a massive, the network had a massive data collection over a couple-year period with 1,000 patients now with a fairly comprehensive database. You can actually read all the what the data collection elements are. It was published in JAMA at the bottom there, March 22nd. Jeff and I were meeting this morning talking about where to go with it. Really, our idea is that this network can be a generative focus on building research around cancer and emergency departments. And so what we'd love to do is to see people who already have different types of research going and then pivot some, and how could you incorporate something in cancer. So things like toxicities and immunotherapy is a really nice one that we can see, how is that treated, what interventions in the emergency department, but capacity building for ED cancer researchers. And so we want to see more and more people just become a part of this network, and we want, if you are a researcher or know researchers that might be interested in this area, it would be fabulous. So just contact Jeff or me. I told Jeff that I would help him in recruitment and marketing, which is one of my strengths. So I think that the future of palliative care and emergency medicine really, in all settings, is going to be spoken to in the healthcare value equation. That quality, the idea that we're just going to keep pushing somebody down the line with things that don't work and just sort of passing them through and allowing them to graduate from high school without being able to read is just not going to work anymore. That we're going to have to improve our quality. We will need to be patient-centered, and so our service, wherever the patient needs to get that service, whether it's the ED or in the office or in the ICU, that we've got to be able to do that. That will be a multiplier. A multiplier value is going to be appropriateness, the right place, time, patient, and context, and the fact that where the safety net does say that yes, we're going to be catching these patients at vulnerable times. And while it might have been more ideal if somebody else had had this conversation, the patient is here with you now, and it's not going to be appropriate to just keep kicking the can down the road. So some concluding thoughts are that we've come a long way, but we're still working on the what and the how, but not the why. I hope that we are not, I hope that we are not still asking the question about why we need to do this. If you are still asking the question why, we have hundreds of articles now to tell you why. We didn't used to have that, and in the early days, really all I did was spend my time talking about why, and I've moved on from why, but the what and how. A strong academic workforce prepares the future of EM providers and leaders. And so this is the place, so wherever your shop is, if you don't have somebody who's doing this, you have to get somebody or do it yourself. We are always open for recruiting new people in this field. And structured teaching and evaluation of palliative care skills in our residency programs is a necessity for the future of healthcare delivery. So I just want to reiterate that these are our questions and reassure you that those who forged out in that little party were not the Donner Party, that we have all made it back more safe and with less thrilling, terrible stories than came back from there. But it certainly has been a trek, and I appreciate everybody in this room who has trekked along with us in this journey. Thank you.
I'd like to open it up for questions.
So Tammie, I have one. You know, when I first started doing stroke work in the 1980s, nobody was doing it. Nobody really cared about it, and I couldn't even publish anything about stroke in the emergency medicine literature because nobody wanted to publish it, and I had to publish somewhere else. Retrospect, now looking back on it, there's actually some advantage to sometimes being one of the early people in the field. I wondered if you'd reflect on that a little bit.
Yeah. So I think. So it was really hard in the early days when you couldn't get your work published. It was actually more, we were writing lots of opinion pieces, and so I will tell you that Catherine Marco, I think, holds a lot of credit for me not quitting, because Catherine is one of the best writers around, and I would, you know, submit an article, and you'd see, you know, we're on lots of articles. I'd submit an article, and it would get trashed, and she would say, "Oh, we're just going to revise it and send it back." You know, she was. So it's this idea that that being trashed early on, or people just not being there with you, is not a reason to quit, but it does make you want to quit. And I think that I had lots of wanting to quit moments early on, and it was really a small circle of individuals who simply just you know, talked to each other constantly on the phone. Rob Zielinski and I were incredible partners, and so I think that in the early days when you couldn't get traction, you simply just had to pick up the phone and keep calling people to make sure that you weren't crazy. There's just so many people like that. I could name a list of about 10 people who were really on that list. I think Catherine was really instrumental in having me not quit in the publication world. And my other colleagues, we were just so tenacious. We knew it was right. We just probably were a little before our time, and people just couldn't do it. I remember my husband says, you know, he always loves to have me tell this story, because also it's who you're married to. Like, my husband has been a really incredible force in my life to have me not quit. We went to, I never forget, you know, like my first teaching gig, I was invited to this course in Maui for like it wasn't a board review, but it was one of those things where you go for 4 hours and you play at the beach the rest of the time. But I was so thrilled to get that. And I gave a talk on palliative care in the emergency department. And actually people stopped me in the middle and said, you know what, this has absolutely no applicability. This is my first teaching gig, right? No applicability, and we really don't get what you're talking about. And I was like, oh my God. I went back to my hotel room, I cried. My husband was like, it's gonna be okay, you know? And, and interestingly, I had an experience, this was 1 year ago. Somebody walked up to me who is an emergency physician, who is now a national medical director of a hospice, who said, I was in that room in Maui in 2000 whatever, and nobody got it, but I got you. I just didn't have the courage to go against the group and say that made a lot of sense to me, and that you changed my career, but I was too embarrassed at the time to go against the grain of what that group said. And so I think that those are the kinds of things to remember, that inside, when you're coming up with new concepts like adaptive trials or whatever, inside people might be saying, that's a really great idea, but I'm kind of scared to, you know, buck the whatever. So I think that's probably the lesson learned, is that whatever people say sometimes is not what they mean. And what they don't say is just things that you never hear, and it can be really, so I think resilience is probably the name of the game. Yeah.
That's awesome. I just have one question regarding when you were talking about the educational pieces, when you had to put in the medical legal structure for that.
Yeah.
It's like, what was it that physicians were concerned about? Was it the concern that families would think that we're giving up on patients when we bring in palliative care, or?
Well, it's more, I think, their hesitancy to, quote unquote, not do everything. So what I did was I had a number of focus groups when we came up with these ideas, and asked people what were their concerns, what were their worries, and why is it that you might not do this or might do that. And it was pretty overwhelmingly clear that people were practicing defensive medicine, and I think that that still goes on today. The reason we all know that that's a reality of this very difficult world that we live in. And so I really felt that if we didn't name that as a core, as something we could talk about as being real, that it would just be it'd continue to be an elephant in the room. And so we created this, and Art Dursey, who some of you know from Medical College of Wisconsin, who's an emergency physician, lawyer, and ethicist, comes and he always does the session for us at Epic Emergency Medicine, and he stays up on case law, and he reassures people that that it's okay to do this based on his understanding as a lawyer, an emergency physician, and an ethicist. And so it's really served us well to keep that in, because it's like people can relax, because we are just going to say we understand that this may be the reason that you might not have that conversation, or that you might start resuscitation in somebody that you think it might not be beneficial, and those sorts of things. Or you might not approach removing life-sustaining therapies when you've got a couple of people who are fighting in front of you, but you have an advance directive that says that they wouldn't want this. So all of those things, we try to address all of those pieces, and then give the attendees the ability, because it's train the trainer, to then go back and train people in that way to be able to have that that language, that vernacular, to be able to get people to uptake. So.
Any other questions? Well, I'd like to thank all of our presenters for their words of wisdom and bringing us into their world of the work that they've poured their lives into. We still have the room for about 10 minutes, so feel free to come up, talk, mingle, integrate, and thank you all for coming out, and thank you all for presenting.
Sure. Thank you.